Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into Text 17. It's quite relevant if you're tackling English reading for, say, postgraduate entrance exams.
Absolutely. It talks about how science itself changed, how it became more structured, I suppose.
Yeah, structured and how people do science change too. So our mission today is basically to break this text down, make it less intimidating.
Right. We'll look at the main idea, how sentences work, some tricky words, and maybe even touch on answering questions about it.
Perfect. So the big picture first. What's Text 17 really about in simple terms?
Well, fundamentally, it's about two big shifts,
Yeah.
specialization and professionalization in science.
Okay, specialization.
Yeah.
Like scientists focusing on smaller and smaller areas.
Exactly. Think of scientific knowledge as this massive growing thing. Too much for one person. Specialization is like saying, okay, you focus on this tiny bit, I'll focus on that tiny bit.
Makes sense. The text mentions geology in the UK as an
Yeah.
example, right?
It does. It's a good case study. And this specialization happened because, well, there was just an increasing accumulation of scientific knowledge, as the first sentence puts it.
Ah, right, that first sentence. Specialization can be seen as a response to the problem of an increasing accumulation of scientific knowledge. Let's unpack that a little.
Sure. The main chunk is specialization can be seen as a response. A
Yeah.
response to what?
To the problem. And
Yeah.
the problem is that accumulation, that growing pile of knowledge.
Precisely. Too much information. So the next bit explains how specialization helped by splitting up the subject matter into smaller units.
One man could continue to handle the information.
Right. It made it manageable again.
Exactly. But then the text throws in a but.
But specialization was only one of a series of related developments. Signals a shift.
It does. It introduces the other big idea.
Yeah.
Another was the growing professionalization of scientific activity.
So specialization and professionalization. What's professionalization about? Is it like science becoming a formal job? That's a good way to put it. Less of a hobby for interested gentlemen, and more something requiring specific training, qualifications, being part of a scientific community.
Okay, so these two things, specialization and professionalization, they're connected.
Very much so. As fields got more specialized, you naturally needed more focused training, which in turn leads to a more professional setup.
Got it. Now moving to the second paragraph, it talks about the line between professional and amateur not being clear-cut.
Yeah, no clear-cut distinction. It means the edges were blurry, especially earlier on. It wasn't always obvious who was who.
But the word amateur started to get a certain feeling around it. The text uses connotation.
Right. A connotation is like an implied meaning or feeling. Here, amateur started to imply maybe someone not fully committed or perhaps not sharing the values of the professional scientific core.
And this links to the consequent requirement for training.
Yes, consequent just means following as a result. Because science was getting specialized and professional, the requirement, the need that followed was for more formal training, often mathematical or lab-based.
Which, as the text sort of hints or implies, made things trickier for the amateurs without that background.
Exactly. It was becoming a general trend, easy to see or obvious, especially in certain fields, geology being the example again.
Okay, let's imagine a typical exam question. Maybe something about what happened to amateur geologists later on, say, in the 20th century. How would we find that?
Well, you'd scan the text for amateur geologists in 20th century. Paragraph 3 looks promising there.
And what does it say happened?
It suggests that their local studies, which used to be valued, became less acceptable to the professionals unless they fit into the wider geological picture.
Ah, so the amateurs often just continue to pursue local studies in the old way.
Right, and that made it harder for them to get published in the main journals, especially with things like refereeing expert reviews coming in.
So the system itself was becoming more formalized, more professional, making it harder for outsiders.
Pretty much. That's the core story of Text 17. Science getting more focused, more specialized, and also more, well, like a profession with entry requirements.
It definitely makes those long sentences seem a bit less scary when you break them down like that. Focusing on the main subject and verb and those connecting words like bet or as a consequence.
Absolutely. Understanding the flow of the argument is key, and watching how word meanings can subtly shift.
So to wrap up, this text is a great example of historical shifts in how science operates, specialization, professionalization, using geology to illustrate it.
And how those shifts affected who could contribute and how scientific work was shared and judged.
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it? How might these same kinds of processes getting more specialized, more professional, be playing out in other fields today? Maybe even areas you're studying or interested in. Something to ponder.
Definitely. How knowledge gets organized and who gets to be the expert. It's a recurring theme.
Well, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.